you feel up to saying prayer, Bill? No? Okay. Thought I'd ask. But we were waiting just for you. Just for you. Papa Tom, how would you like to lead us in prayer? Before we do, I just want to thank everybody for their prayers for my mother. She got out of the hospital yesterday evening, and so everything seems to be doing very well. I think so.
Father, we are grateful for your love, your grace, life of I may have to go back up there. Forgiveness of our sins. Father, we pray that you'll be with us this morning. Thank you so much for prayer. Take it to our hearts. Take it to our lives and live it out. Father, thank you for your history, mankind, how you have guided us from the very beginning. Father, forgive us for our sins. In Christ's name we pray.
Amen. Okay. As I mentioned last week, I'm going to be ambitious today. Okay? I'm going to try and cover the entire book of Hosea in one class. And the first thing I thought I'd do is give you a vote. Because I know how everybody really loves my expansive air maps, right? But would you believe I finally found a bona fide map? So all in favor of my air maps over that, say aye or whatever. Got 2 hands, 3 hands. Okay, good. Everybody who wants that map. I got my pointer right here. Now, it doesn't mean that your vote's going to matter, okay? Just so you'll know. See if it shows up. Now I got to point at the screen. Hosea. Hosea is 14 chapters, and it is the first of what's called, well, the second, technically, because Daniel is included in the minor prophets. You've got your major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Daniel goes back and forth between the two, but normally he's included in the minor prophets. And basically all that means is Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are long, and the rest of the prophets are relatively short, 14 chapters or less. Some of them are only a single chapter long. When you're studying the minor prophets, one of the confusing things is they're not arranged the way I think I would have done it, because I would prefer they were arranged in chronological order. This one wrote, and then this one wrote, and that's not the way they are. So you have to, when you're studying the book, you have to go back and recognize the setting in which they're written and to whom they're speaking. Okay, so if you could see these maps, I know you can't read them, that's fine. This, and I'm colorblind, remember, but this section is green. Everybody see that color? Okay, good. And that section is purple. The difference between the two sections, the green section is what's referred to as Israel. After Solomon's son takes the throne, the kingdom splits. 10.5 tribes leave Solomon's son and refuse to have him as king, and they establish their own kingdom. And from that point on, for the next almost half a millennia, from that point on, you've got 2 kingdoms. You've got Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Now that will go on until 722 BC, at which time this green section is captured by the Assyrian Empire, and the Israelites who lived there, all of them of any status anyway, are carried off and settled in foreign lands. And the Assyrian king brings in foreigners, idolaters, and settles them in this same region, this green region. And so this part of it, anyway, becomes Samaria. And that's where we get the Samaritans. They intermarried with the poorest Israelites who were left, and you got this culture of half-Jews who had polluted their bloodline They introduced idolatry and pagan worship alongside the worship of the living God. And so that's where you get Samaria. Now, I'm making all of this point to let you know where Hosea is working. Because when Hosea prophesies, he prophesies after the kingdoms had split, and God sends him primarily, that's why I use an air map, right? God sends him primarily to the green section. His message is aimed primarily at Israel. He'll say a few things to Judah. But what he's basically letting Israel know is that God's had enough of their idolatry, and he's had enough of their rebellion, and he is getting ready to remove them. And in less than 100 years from the time of Hosea, the green section disappears from history. You never see those 10.5 tribes again because they no longer exist as an independent people. When you think of Jews, you're thinking of people from the purple section. Boy, I can't even hold the pointer still. Let's see if I can do it with 2 hands. That's close enough. You're thinking about people from the purple section. That's the only Jews who remain and continue to protect their bloodline as a whole. It's the only tribe. And so everything, when we talk about Jews today, they're all descendants, or supposed to be descendants, of Judah. That green section, they're not in history anymore. They've ceased to exist as an independent people. So, to start this off, and I told Luke I'd only use the map for a few minutes. To start this off, I wanted you to understand where, step over that, where this distinction comes from. And right about there is Jerusalem. So the capital of Judah is just a stone's throw from the northern border. And that's their capital. That's where the temple is. That's how close the Assyrian Empire comes to conquering both nations. They do lay siege to Jerusalem, so they make it across the frontier, but they're not able to finish the deal. God strikes a huge number of their soldiers down, and they flee. So Judah's spared for another 150 years, give or take. So when we talk about Hosea, he comes in toward the end of what's referred to as the divided kingdom. Israel to the north in the green, Judah to the south in the purple. By the time less than 100 years after Hosea prophesies, the green section disappears. Okay, Luke, I'm done with the map. Okay, we did good. I still have the map here, and I'm sure you can read it here too. Yeah, but you can see the colors, so that part works okay. Now, when we're talking about Hosea, first thing we need to look at, I need to do some background first. Go back to 2 Kings chapter 9. 2 Kings 9 and 10. Because I've got to introduce a couple of things to make sure we're aware of this. Okay, 2 Kings chapter 9. There's a fellow named Jehu. He is a military leader, and he is serving in the northern tribe, the Green Nation. He's serving there as one of the leaders of their army, and he's serving under the rule of Jeroboam II. Jeroboam was the first king of the Green Nation. His son is now on the throne, and God is sick and tired of the wickedness of Jeroboam, and so he's going to wipe out Jeroboam's household. And so he sends an unnamed prophet to anoint, Elisha sends a prophet to anoint Jehu, tell him that God has chosen you to replace Jeroboam's lineage, and you're supposed to go up and wipe out his lineage. And so Jehu takes the anointing, and he goes to carry out God's instruction. While he's at it, not only does Jehu wipe out Jeroboam II, he wipes out all of his sons. Now, I'm just summarizing chapters 9 and 10, but I wanted you to understand this word Jezreel, because that's going to show up in Hosea a couple of times. We won't read a lot about it, but I want you to understand. Not only does Jehu wipe out Jeroboam and his household, all of his descendants, he also wipes out the son of Ahab, and he wipes out Jezebel. You probably remember him. Wipes out Ahab's 70 sons, and even Ahaziah, who's going to be the next king of Judah. He kills 42 of his family as well. And so Jehu engages in a widespread, large-scale massacre. And it all centers around this place called Jezreel, which Hosea shows up in a minute. And in Hosea's message, God is prophesying punishment for the events of Jezreel. And so one of the things scholars wrestle with is, why would God punish somebody for doing what he told them to do in the first place? Well, the problem is when Jehu did wipe out Jeroboam and dealt with all the wicked idolatry and all the perversion of Jeroboam's kingdom, Jehu decided he liked that way of life, and so his rule was the same. And so God said, hey, you're doing the same thing, I'm going to wipe you out. That's the background for Jezreel. That just kind of gives you a little bit of feel for that term when it shows up in Hosea. Okay, a couple other things. How many people have found Hosea in your Bible? Okay, at least we know we're on the same page. When you go to the book, as happens more than once anyway, God not only has Hosea deliver a verbal message, but he has him deliver a visual message. And he gives Hosea, and we don't know a lot about Hosea other than what's given in the opening verse of the book, and even that is very indistinct in so many ways, but his ministry covers at least 30 years, probably a little bit more. The first thing he tells Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, here's how God starts his revelation to Hosea. He says, when the Lord began to speak by Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, for the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel. There's our word. Call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will avenge the blood of Jezreel on the house of Jehu, and bring an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel, the northern or green nation. It shall come to pass in that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Verse 6, she conceived again and bore a daughter. Now, compare verse 6 with the last part of verse 3 and tell me what the differences are after she conceives. What are the differences in those two verses? There's two differences. What? The first one is what gender? A son. Second's a daughter. What's missing in verse 6 after that isn't missing in verse 3? Huh? Bore what? Read the next word. Verse 3. Bore him a son. Now, that expressly says this is his child. The next two children don't have that expression, which generally would indicate they probably weren't his. So you get an idea of the character of the individual God has instructed Hosea to marry. And he knew her character before he married her. So there are three children born. Only the first one is said bore to him. And maybe it's not important, but it would be unusual if it isn't. But verse 6 again, it says, call her name Lo, which means not, Ruhamah. For I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah, the purple kingdom. So Hosea is talking to the northern kingdom. He's giving a warning to Judah. He's saying, you're not facing the same fate yet. But by the end of the book, you find out you very probably will. Verse 8, when she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. God said, call his name Lo, or not, Ami, my people. For you are not my people, and I will not be your God. And so the first rattle out of the box, before he even starts preaching, he's supposed to take a wife who's got a very colorful, how's that for a descriptive term? A very colorful background. You know that. You were supposed to marry what kind of, when it came to, properly done, you were supposed to marry a virgin. Okay? And God says, no, Hosea, that's not how you're going to do this. You're going to take a woman who's already got a scandalous background. Take her, join her in marriage. There are going to be 3 kids conceived while you're in marriage, and then she's going to leave you. And she does. Now I'm going to jump ahead. So he's had 3 children, at least they're born into his household, 3 children by this woman of questionable character. It's not even questionable. And their names are all already picked by God, and none of them bring good news. And so that's how this prophet begins his ministry, by God saying, your life's going to be a spectacle. Everybody who looks at you is going to go, what is he thinking? And that was the point. Because God says, we're going to get the message across before you even open your mouth. Now, I want you to jump ahead to chapter 3, shortest chapter in the book. Again, now, there's been 3 children born in his house. She has left. She is engaged with many other lovers. And God says, go again, love a woman who's loved by a lover and is committing adultery, just like the love of the Lord for the children of Israel who look to other gods and love the raisin cakes of the pagans. So I bought her for myself for 15 shekels of silver, 1.5 homers of barley. Said to her, you shall stay with me many days. You shall not play the harlot, nor shall you have a man. So too will I be toward you. Basically, he took her as wife. She left. Now he's bought her as a slave, and she no longer has the option. Again, his life is a living spectacle. Now, that introduces us to another very important term in Hosea. I like the way that the New King James and some of the more modern English translations try and use language that is less graphic and less offensive. But that's not the best translation. The Old King James will use the word repeatedly, whoredom. And that's the most specific translation. It is a very graphic and offensive term, as it should be. Because God is trying to get across his righteous anger against Israel's persistent whoredom. And so he will use that word constantly as you go through the book. Every time you see a word translated harlot, harlotry, or adultery, the difference between adultery and whoredom was it's the same word. If a woman is unmarried, it's whoredom, and if she's married, it's adultery. Okay? It means taking any and every other lover except the one God says you're supposed to have. This book is filled with that language. And again, we're not going to go through verse by verse. That's not my point. I'd like to encourage you to read it. But I want to give you the tools so that when you read it, you understand what God's saying. He's using very graphic language because in his mind, the greatest sin Israel could commit is spiritual whoredom. And what he means by that is selling herself to anyone other than her true husband, which is God. And so when she went after pagan idols, when she went after false gods, the gods of the peoples or the gods of the other nations, he says, you're committing spiritual whoredom. And that is the gravest, that's where the 10 Commandments start. You do not entertain any other God but me. And Hosea is a book that's filled with the righteous husband's proper wrath against being spurned, being deserted by the wife of his youth, who basically totally turned her back on all of her vows, on everything she said she would do, and is doing everything in her power to bring shame on her husband. That's the background of Hosea. And he's using the prophet's life and his message to reveal his own hurt and the reason his wrath is going to be so severe against the northern 10 tribes. When these tribes split, when the green split from the purple under Solomon's son's reign, and Jeroboam takes the throne, here's Jerusalem, as I mentioned. So it's right at the northern part. Jeroboam didn't want his people going back to Jerusalem to worship during the feast days. So the first thing he does is he sets up an alternate worship site. He actually sets up two. He sets up one in Bethel, which ironically means house of God, Israel's God. And he sets up the other up here in Dan. And guess what he puts in both of them? The same image. It's a golden calf. Kind of like what happened at Sinai. And so he sets up alternate fake religious sites and tells the people, hey, this is just as pleasing to God as going to Jerusalem. Well, it doesn't take any time for them to go, phew, because if you can change that, then you can change this, then you can change that, then you can change that. And so they begin to embrace idolatry. They begin to look for help when they start to have problems from Assyria, who's way off up here. I know, air map again. Way off up here, and from Egypt, who's way down here, the two world powers, because Assyria is getting bigger and bigger and more threatening and more threatening. And so Israel's safety and security, and for that matter, her survival is being threatened. And so she appeals to Egypt for help. Egypt says no, because Assyria, they're afraid of Assyria, basically. She appeals to Assyria for help. Well, Assyria is going to take that appeal and basically use that as an excuse to come in and erase the northern kingdom. And so the entire book is focused on Israel's unfaithfulness to the covenant relationship, the marriage between God and his bride Israel. And the bulk of Israel, remember Israel is composed of how many tribes? 12. 10.5 tribes have basically said, now, how would you do that in a marriage relationship? Okay, Sam, I'm going to use you and Barbara. Let's see. Barbara, that would mean everything but your head and your right shoulder says you're not going to be married to Sam. So that part of your body leaves, and your head and right shoulder stays with Sam. How's that for a visual aid? That's what's going on here. And so when you read Hosea, it's an important read for a couple of reasons. And one of them is it explains why God in 722 BC allows Assyria to come in, to destroy Samaria, to conquer their armies completely, and to carry off anyone out of the green nation into captivity and settle them all over the Assyrian Empire, which won't be quite as big as the Roman Empire, but it's pretty big. Settles them all over the Roman Empire, Assyrian Empire, and brings all these pagan foreigners in. They settle here. You know what, I should show you. We'll look at that maybe in a minute. They settle down there. They begin to intermarry. And so when the time of Jesus arrives, you've got Judah, and you've got what? Due north of it? Samaria. And how did the Jews feel about folks called Samaritans? They were disgusted by it. Why? Because they were half-breed, and I know that's not a politically correct term, but they were half-breed Jews. They had corrupted blood, and their worship of Israel's God, which they claimed to be doing, the woman at the well, she and Jesus have that discussion. They claim to be worshiping Israel's God, but they've actually mixed it with worship of the idols. And so it's not a pure worship. It's not a worship according to the covenant, God's law. And it's not a worship that's carried out in Jerusalem those 3 times a year. There's nothing about Samaria's worship that is consistent with the law. And yet they view themselves as descendants of Abraham and as having a valid place to worship. And so you read John chapter 3, the woman at the well, the woman says, we say you worship here, and you Jews say you worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus says, well, the Jews are right, but the time's coming and now is when location isn't going to matter because something new was coming. And so Hosea it lays the groundwork for so much of that background. And when Israel, the northern 10 tribes, the green nation, when she disappears from history, Hosea records the struggle in God's heart, literally, to carry out the wrath. Because as you read through the closing chapters, you find that God says, how can I do this to you? As a parent to a child, how can I let you go? But he has to. So he doesn't do it because he wants to. He doesn't do it because he's a God of wrath. He does it because he cannot not do it and still be holy and righteous. And as you go through the book, you will see that struggle. You'll see him offer hope. And again, we're not reading much of this. I know you're aware of that. I want to give you the background for the book. And if you see the word Ephraim, he's just referring to one of the probably the most prominent tribe in the northern nation. He's still talking about Israel, the northern 10 tribes, just using that term to describe it. Where does he call him back? Go ahead. Okay.
Were the Samaritans, the half-breeds, considered Gentile?
Actually, they were considered worse than Gentiles. Gentiles, a Jew would have looked at a Gentile and said, well, at least you have an excuse. You've never known the God of Israel. Samaritans claimed to know the God of Israel and yet rejected God's law. They rejected most of the Torah. They probably accepted at least through the story of Abraham. But somewhere along the end of that, they said, no, the rest of that that's addition. It's not necessary. So when the Jews viewed Samaritans, they actually viewed them as worse than Gentiles because they claimed to know the one true God and yet refused to truly embrace him, which meant to the Jews, do it our way. You know. Okay, that's one. Second question.
And then, I don't know so much a question as an observation. I want to see if you agree with it. On a cursory look through all of Hosea, it seems like, we know at least for the duration of at least 3 pregnancies and deliveries, God keeps saying, name of this because this is what I'm going to do. But during Hosea, it doesn't happen.
Right.
Is it fair to infer that the people in this time, because God said I will, but he hadn't become complacent in what they're doing with their life, and is that a parallel to today?
Oh, I like the, okay, now I know where your statement is. Is that a parallel to today? I think very much so. Very much so. Because the scoffers Peter talked about in 2 Peter 3, you can see that in our culture all around us. God's not going to destroy the world. He never has. He hasn't done it, in forever. And, of course, if you believe the 5 billion year history or whatever theory, and I realize we can disagree on that, then you can go, he's only done it once in all of 5 billion years. But, our culture is very much complacent against. So that's 2. I agree.
Is it still a sin to eat raisin cakes?
If they're offered to idols. It was a part of the idol worship. And it was an abuse of the wine. You can go back and find in the law that the raisins were questionable for Israel to take. She was supposed to use grapes and make wine, right? Raisins were, let's face it, if you looked at a raisin next to a grape, you'd say that's no good if you didn't know it was a raisin because it looks rotten, When I have a plum that shrivels up like a raisin, I throw it away. Just saying. So couple of distinctions in there. In The Chosen, there's a scene where one of them says something about raisins, and one of the other ones gets this look on their face like, really? You know, that's the background for that. Okay, so that covered all three. Hot dog. I like that. Okay, let me, and there are several passages we could go through here. We might look at them. For instance, look at Hosea 11, verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Anybody recognize that from anywhere in the New Testament? Who is it talking about? After Jesus is born, the wise men visit him at their house, and then God warns Joseph in a dream that Herod's going to kill all of the little ones. And so where are Joseph and Mary and Jesus supposed to flee? They go to Egypt, right? And this very passage out of Hosea 11:1 is used as one more fulfillment. Jesus is the Messiah. Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, in the context, Hosea is reminding Israel about her background. I saved you once, I rescued you out of Egypt, and yet part of the punishment he's going to describe in various places in the book is you're going to go back into Egypt, which means back into captivity. The northern 10.5 tribes are going to be carried back and cease to exist. God's not going to rescue them anymore. There's several other verses I'm probably not going to. Look at chapter 14, verse 1. Even though God has told them what he has to do, you still, the last chapter opens with a plea to the people. O Israel, return to the Lord your God, for you've stumbled because of your iniquity. Take words with you, return to the Lord, say to him, and God even gives him the words to say. Take away all iniquity, receive us graciously, for we will offer the sacrifices of our lips. Assyria won't save us, we will not ride on horses, nor will we say any more to the work of our hands, the idols. You are our gods, for in you the fatherless finds mercy. I will heal their backsliding. I will love them freely. And he goes on to describe, but the reality is, even though he pleads to them, they're going to refuse. He knows what they're going to do. Chapter 13. I started with 14:1. Look at this just gives you a taste of the punishment that's coming. Verse 16 of chapter 13. Tell me this isn't graphic language. If this was a movie rating, this language is basically R rating. So you'll know. Samaria is held guilty. She has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces. Their women with child ripped open. That's graphic, violent language. God's not pulling any punches. When he sends Hosea in to Israel and says, will you listen? It's your last chance. And Israel says, as Bill pointed out, no big deal. They become complacent. The difference between Israel and modern culture, in my mind, is that we've got no evidence that Israel ever has a moment when she says, I wonder if this is going to be true, and has a moment when she actually reacts and tries to repent. At least a couple of times in my lifetime, our culture has God's gotten their attention. I view it that way, and they've reacted. There's no evidence from the time of, Elijah on, but there's no evidence at any point did the northern kingdom ever go, I wonder if God means what he says. David?
Tomorrow, 9/11, we will be remembering, a lot of people will be remembering how this country as a whole had and needed to come together.
Yes.
Reevaluate where we are, or
Yes.
where we were,
And how long did that last?
Hopefully, yes, make the changes necessary to not let ourselves as a country be subjected to such evil.
Yes.
We failed. Didn't take long. We failed again.
Yep.
But as Hosea points out, our time is limited. We need to really refocus our lives on what's most important.
Right. On what's most important. And I'm not saying that nobody in the northern kingdom did, because we know that some of them, when the kingdom split, left from these other tribes and joined themselves to Judah. They still lost their identity as a tribe. They would have had to intermarry with Jews, people from the tribe of Judah, and they would have lost their identity as a separate tribe. But the nations as a whole, the nation as a whole, there is no evidence at any time. There was no 9/11 where you saw them go, I wonder if, even Nineveh, when Jonah preached, they had one of those moments, and it lasted about that long. But at least it was there. Israel, and that's one of the undergirding messages of this, is every prophet that God sends to the northern kingdom is treated as if they're, matter of fact, Hosea uses the language, I can't tell you exactly where it is, I meant to mark it, is treated as if he's insane and he's a madman. Why? Because all of their other priests, all of their other prophets were saying, hey, everything's good, the dollar's strong, we don't have any enemies threatening on our borders, even though Israel had already started this steep decline from prosperity. Anybody who was paying attention would have seen the signs, but all the talking heads were going, no big deal, it's not a problem. We're just having a little downturn in the economy, but it's not a depression or anything to worry about. So you had all these voices going, everything's great, the king says everything's great, the princes say everything's great. Hosea even has this one passage where he says, even the princes go out and join hands with the drunkards. And so they were encouraging that lifestyle. They were encouraging debauchery. They were encouraging idolatry. They were encouraging anything that would get the people's minds off of the temple at Jerusalem, God's covenant, and the God of Israel. Anything and everything. And so it was a constant from the moment they depart from under Solomon's son, from the moment they depart, it is a steady downward decline. And Hosea is I mean, you're getting closer and closer to the edge of the cliff, and Hosea can see the edge of the cliff from there. We don't know if he knew exactly when it was going to happen, but he knew what was coming, and he says, listen, won't somebody wake up? And the people are going, la, 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 everything's great, no big deal, wickedness is ripe. And so the message of Hosea will come startlingly true in the next, in a generation, basically. And this kingdom that started out, remember where she started. She started out as a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. Possession of the promised land, the whole kit and caboodle. That was her beginning, her roots. She was evidence of God's love, evidence of God's power, evidence of God's selection, evidence of God's delivery and victory. She started out just dynamite under Joshua. You could say under Moses, but you had that whole 40-year thing. But when she conquers the land and it's parted out and everybody receives the land that's supposed to stay in their family forever. And it only takes, let's see, Saul and David and Solomon, so the fourth king, and this wonderful expression of God's grace and God's love and God's mercy splits in two. And this one turns their back on God and all that he's done for them, and just becomes mired in idolatry. And as I say, after 722, this is all that's left, the purple section. And everything Israel today are descendants of this tribe, not these. They're gone. And so Israel's having to take, God's having to take, 10/12, how's that, of the fulfillment of his promise, his beacon that was supposed to shine light to the world. And he's supposed to take over half of that and tear it away and remove it from the story. Hosea is a powerful book. And when you read it against the visual aid, the life that Hosea had to live, he was shamed. He was, if you didn't know the background and you watched him do this, you'd go, man, you're an idiot. And he had to live that. He didn't have any choice in the matter. And then you got to go buy her back. Oh. Which God's law said was an abomination. But he's got a purpose behind this. Because that's what God wants to do with Israel, even though she has, and again, that graphic term, even though she's played the whore. And she's done it with her eyes wide open. She's done it fully by her choice. She can't say, well, I didn't know any better, or I was overcome. No, she's done this. Set her sights on it, and that's what she's done. And God said, if you'll come back to me, I'll buy you back. I'll take you back to myself in spite of the fact that you've exposed me to ridicule and shame. God says, I'll still welcome you back. And Israel says, thanks, but no thanks. Tough book. But it's an important book. We could have looked at multiple passages throughout this that are used in the New Testament. I'm going to do that right now. I just wanted to lay background and expose you to something maybe you haven't ever really looked at it this way. But when you do, David?
So, did he write this stuff down, or did he say it to somebody? And the second part is, because of the type of life that he had to live, how would he have gotten an audience with the Jewish people?
How would he probably did not get an audience with the Jewish people. There's no evidence that he ever went to Judah and delivered the message. So they would have gotten it either by word of mouth or more likely when they got a copy of the written book. Because keep in mind, this book is preserved as scripture, which means either Hosea or a scribe, and we're not told which, but one of the two, when they write this out, who has to preserve this book? The northern tribes? No, they cease to exist. The fact that we have Hosea at all means that people from the tribe of Judah accepted the book, copied it, kept it as a part of their scriptures. And so they got the message. It might have been when they got the copy of the manuscript from Hosea. It seems Hosea delivers this verbally, although again, we're not given any specific location, any time frames. We're told he ministers for this long, but we just aren't given much. The only narrative details we're given are about his marital life and woes and all that stuff. Everything else, it's a message being proclaimed somewhere. There is a possibility, because he does speak about Bethel a couple of times, there is a possibility that he would have delivered at least part of that right there, which was one of Israel's original holy sites. But even that's conjecture, because the text doesn't tell us. We assume Hosea wrote it down because a scribe is never mentioned in the book. But it could have been a scribe who heard him, a helper. Again, there's a lot of gray there. And I should mention, there are some questionable passages in the book. When I say questionable, I mean what the most accurate translation of this particular part of this verse, because there are, between the Septuagint, the Greek translation, and the Hebrew, what's referred to as the Masoretic text, the two of them take very different directions on some of their expressions. And so there are some big question marks about specific wording in a few of the sections. But so that helps you understand. We just don't have a lot of manuscript background for this book, other than the scripture by the Jews and by the New Testament. It's applied to the story of Jesus. That's pretty big confirmation. Any other questions, comments? Was that the first or the second? Second. Okay, then